There was a feeling that arrived every single week of your childhood, and it never once knocked before it came in. It didn't matter how good the weekend had been. It didn't matter that you'd spent Saturday climbing a fence you weren't supposed to climb, or that Sunday lunch had just been carved and the whole house still smelled of roast potatoes and gravy. Somewhere around 4 o'clock, sometimes earlier, that feeling would settle into your chest like a stone dropped into a pond. If you grew up in Britain in the 1970s, you already know exactly what I'm talking about. You don't need me to name it. Your body just remembered it the second I said Sunday evening. Today we're going back there. Not to the nostalgia postcard version, the one with milk floats and penny sweets and nothing but sunshine. We're going into the real texture of that specific dread. The one that had a smell, a sound, and a shape, and the one that nobody at the time ever explained to you, because every single adult around you had felt it too and simply accepted it as the price of being alive. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why your stomach used to drop at a certain hour. Let's start with the quiet. Actual, physical quiet. In the 1970s, shops in Britain were closed on Sundays. Not some shops, nearly all of them. This wasn't an accident or a coincidence of small-town life. It was the law. Under the Shops Act of 1950, which had been on the books since just after the war, most retailers were legally barred from trading on a Sunday. And that law stayed in force right through your childhood and for years afterward, all the way until the Sunday Trading Act of 1994 finally changed it. So picture what that actually meant for a child. No shopping center to wander around. No distraction to buy. The high street outside your window was simply switched off, curtains down, shutters up, and the whole town seemed to be holding its breath along with you. Long silence wasn't neutral. Silence like that gives a child's mind room to think, and what your mind turned to: homework you'd been avoiding since Friday, a bag that needed packing, and underneath all of it, a sense that the fun part of existence had a closing time, and that closing time was creeping toward you across the afternoon like a tide you couldn't stop. Now let's talk about the sound, because the sound is where this gets almost eerie in how precisely it was engineered into your nervous system, even though nobody intended it that way. On BBC Radio there was a program called Sing Something Simple. It had been running since 1959, performed by Cliff Adams and the Cliff Adams Singers, with Jack Emblow on the accordion. Gentle old songs stitched together into a soft, cozy half-hour. It sounds harmless. It was harmless. And that is exactly what made it so devastating. Because for an entire generation of British children, that program was the soundtrack to Sunday evening bath time, the wireless propped up somewhere in or near the bathroom while your mother ran the water and you sat there getting scrubbed clean for the school week ahead. The moment those opening notes played, your body understood something your brain hadn't caught up to yet. It understood that the weekend was over. Not almost over. Over. And no 5-year-old, no 10-year-old had the words for what that music actually meant. It simply arrived in your chest as dread, wrapped in something that sounded like comfort. Then, not long after, came songs of praise on BBC One, hymns drifting out of some cathedral or chapel somewhere else in the country, sung by people who all seemed impossibly calm, as though they didn't know what evening it was. If Sing Something Simple was the sound of your bath running cold, Songs of Praise was the sound of the last light disappearing from the room. Between the two of them, an entire nation of children was being quietly informed week after week that the good part of life had ended, and that the machine of school was about to start turning again. And while all of that was happening in the background, your body was already being prepared for Monday in ways you had no say over. There was the ritual of the school uniform. Your mother, or sometimes your grandmother, standing at the ironing board with the television murmuring behind her, pressing the same grey jumper and the same white shirt that had been worn all week and washed at the weekend, getting it crisp and ready to be put on again in the morning. There was the smell of that, warm cotton and starch, and it became fused in your memory with the exact feeling of dread, so that even now, the smell of a freshly ironed shirt can pull you straight back to being 9 years old on a Sunday evening. Then there were the shoes, black leather school shoes, scuffed from a week of playground football, being polished at the kitchen table with a tin of black kiwi polish and a soft yellow cloth, Your father or your mother spitting on the brush, the old-fashioned way to get a proper shine. It looks, in memory, like a small act of love. And it was. But at the time, as a child watching those shoes get polished, all you could think was that they were being prepared for a battlefield you didn't want to walk onto. And underneath all of that sat the thing you had been avoiding since Friday afternoon. The homework. Maybe it was long division. Maybe it was a composition about your summer holiday that had been set weeks ago and forgotten the moment the bell rang. With the light fading and songs of praise humming in the background, you'd finally drag it out. And you'd sit at the table trying to finish in 40 minutes what should have taken all weekend. Your handwriting getting worse with every line as the clock ticked toward bedtime. Before we go further into just how deep this feeling ran, and into the one detail almost nobody talks about that made it even heavier for children in this particular decade, it would mean a great deal if you hit that subscribe button right now. This channel exists to bring these memories back properly, with real facts and real respect for the people who lived through them. And the only way more of these stories reach you is if you're subscribed. While you're at it, drop a comment below and tell me which part of this Sunday feeling hit you the hardest. The sound of the radio, the smell of the ironing, or something else entirely that's just come flooding back. And if this is bringing it all back for you, share it with a friend who'll remember it exactly the same way. Now, let's go a little deeper, because there's a part of this story that's rarely told, and it says something quite serious about what childhood actually looked like in that decade. Because this Sunday evening feeling wasn't happening in isolation. It was happening against the backdrop of a country that was genuinely struggling. In 1971, free school milk, which had been given to every child in Britain since the Education Act of 1944, was withdrawn from children over the age of 7. The decision was made by the then Education Secretary Margaret Thatcher, and it became so unpopular that she was nicknamed in the press and in playgrounds up and down the country, Thatcher, Milk Snatcher. For children who had grown up expecting that small bottle at morning break as simply part of how school worked, its disappearance was one more small sign that the adult world was tightening its belt, and that the comfortable certainties of earlier childhood were quietly being taken away, one at a time. That sense of things tightening wasn't confined to milk. In 1974, industrial disputes and an energy crisis forced the government to introduce what became known as the 3-day week, a measure that restricted commercial use of electricity to 3 consecutive days out of every 7 in order to conserve coal stocks during a miners' strike. For families up and down the country, that meant candles kept by the back door, torches checked for working batteries, and evenings spent doing homework, or trying to by candlelight, because the power had simply been switched off by decree. If you were a child during those months, you didn't understand the politics of it. All you understood was that the world felt unstable in a way that made the ordinary comforts of home, the television, the warm kitchen, the electric fire, feel conditional rather than guaranteed. And that instability folded itself quietly into the general mood of a Sunday evening. Because Sunday evening was already the moment when you were most aware that comfort was running out. There was also decimalization in February of 1971, when Britain's currency changed overnight from pounds, shillings and pence into the new decimal system. For adults, it was a headache at the till. For children, pocket money suddenly meant different coins, different sums, a different way of understanding what a sweet or a comic actually cost. It was one more small piece of evidence, alongside the missing milk and the candlelit evenings, that the world you'd been born into was shifting under your feet, whether you'd been asked about it or not. None of these things caused the Sunday evening feeling on their own, but they sat underneath it, like sediment, giving that ordinary weekly dread an extra weight that children in other decades simply didn't carry in the same way. Now here is the part that almost nobody has ever said out loud, and it's the part that changes how you should think about everything we've just described. That feeling you had sitting in the bath while Sing Something Simple played, or hunched over unfinished homework as the light faded, wasn't unique to you, long at a personal failing, and it certainly wasn't something wrong with you specifically. It had a pattern so consistent, so widely shared across an entire generation, that decades later, writers and researchers looking back at British television scheduling in that era gave it an almost clinical description. They called it a Pavlovian response. The same mechanism a dog trainer uses with a bell and a bowl of food. Except in this case, the bell was a theme tune, and what it triggered wasn't hunger, it was dread. To really understand how the dread built, you have to walk through the whole day. Because Sunday didn't start as something frightening. It started for a lot of families as something close to lovely. Many households went to church in the morning, or to Sunday school if the grown-ups didn't fancy the full service themselves. Children in their better clothes, scrubbed and combed, sitting through hymns they only half understood. Afterwards came the best smell of the entire week, the Sunday roast, beef or lamb or a chicken if the budget stretched to it. Potatoes roasting and dripping, cabbage or sprouts boiling on the hob until the whole kitchen filled with that thick, warm, slightly overcooked vegetable smell that, even now, some of you can't smell without being transported straight back to your nan's kitchen. After dinner came the best part of the whole week, in a strange way, because it was the part with the least structure. Perhaps a walk if the weather allowed it. Perhaps the football results being read out gravely on the radio, that particular rhythm of names and scores that meant nothing to a child, but somehow felt important because the adults went quiet for it. On some Sunday afternoons there was live football highlights on the television, grainy footage of a match that had been played the day before, men in shorts far shorter than anyone wears now, commentators speaking in the calm, unhurried tone of an era with nowhere urgent to be. For a few hours in that stretch between lunch and roughly 4 o'clock, Sunday still felt like part of the weekend. It still belonged to you, and then, somewhere around 4, the light would begin to change. This mattered more than people realize, especially once autumn arrived and the clocks went back, because in the darker months that shift in the light happened earlier and earlier, sometimes barely past 3 in the afternoon. The sky would turn that particular flat, heavy gray that has no drama to it at all, just a slow graying out, like someone quietly closing a curtain on the day. And the moment the light started to go, so did your mood. It's a strange thing to admit, but ask anyone who lived through it, and they'll tell you the same thing. The exact hour the sky changed color was the exact hour the feeling arrived, as reliably as a clock striking. By early evening, the machinery of the week ahead had properly started. The bath was run. The radio, or later the television, carried you through it. The uniform came off its hanger, freshly ironed, and was laid out for the morning with a kind of quiet ceremony, almost funereal in how routine and unavoidable it felt. Your shoes sat by the door, polished and waiting. Somewhere in the house a parent was doing exactly the same thing in their own way, laying out their own work clothes, dreading their own Monday in a way you were too young to fully notice. Because to a child, adults always seem to have everything under control, even when, as you now know as an adult yourself, they very much did not. That's a detail worth sitting with for a moment. You weren't the only one in the house feeling it. Your mother, ironing that uniform while songs of praise played in the background, was very likely dreading her own week, her own list of jobs, her own difficult boss or difficult day ahead. Your father, polishing his own work shoes at the same kitchen table where he'd just polished yours, was carrying the exact same stone in his own chest that you were carrying in yours. Nobody talked about it. That generation didn't really have the language for naming a feeling, let alone sharing it out loud with a child. So the house would simply go quiet together, each person alone with an identical dread, sitting in the same rooms, saying nothing. It's worth pausing here to notice something else. Something that says a lot about how far things have changed, and not always for the worse. Today, this exact feeling has a name that gets thrown around casually online. The Sunday scaries, discussed openly, joked about, even treated by some workplaces as something to actively manage. There are articles about beating it, podcasts about coping with it, colleagues who'll admit to each other over coffee that Sunday evening always gets them low. None of that existed for you. There was no shared vocabulary, no sense that this was a recognized, ordinary, almost universal human experience. You simply felt it, alone, in a cold bathroom or at a kitchen table, and assumed it meant something was wrong specifically with you. It didn't. It never did. But nobody was going to tell a 9-year-old that in 1974, by the time the decade drew to a close, that Sunday evening ritual had gathered a few more layers. From 1979 onward, a new program joined the furniture of Sunday early evening television, one focused on old family heirlooms being brought in and valued by quiet, softly spoken experts. It became, almost instantly, one more entry in the growing list of programs whose theme music alone could make a certain kind of British person feel their stomach drop, even those who'd never sat through a single full episode. The specific show barely mattered. What mattered was the slot it occupied, that particular hour when the day was dying and the week was waking up. And then, of course, came Monday morning itself, the destination that all of Sunday evening's dread had been quietly pointing toward. The alarm clock, if your family owned one that actually worked reliably. The cold outside the blankets, the uniform, stiff with ironing, going on over skin that still smelled faintly of last night's bath. Breakfast eaten too fast, or sometimes not eaten at all if you'd overslept because you'd stayed up too late trying to avoid Sunday evening for as long as possible. Then the walk to school, often alone or with siblings, no parent driving you because in most families there was only one car, if that, and it belonged to your father for work. At school, the week would open with assembly, everyone standing in rows in a cold hall singing a hymn that felt suspiciously similar to the ones from Songs of Praise the night before, as though the institution of school and the institution of Sunday evening television had somehow conspired against you. Then into the classroom, where homework would be collected, and where, if it was unfinished, or worse, not done at all, there could be real consequences. This was an era in British schools when corporal punishment, the cane or the slipper, was still entirely legal, and still regularly used right through the 1970s, not abolished in state schools until 1986. For some children, the fear of Monday wasn't abstract or emotional at all. It was the very real fear of a teacher's hand, or a ruler, or a cane, waiting for anyone who hadn't finished that composition or those long division sums the night before. Long thack the copper textures aduperative, that was ich fill the milieu a conifmotive one all pairs toughen that. For a significant number of children, it was the entirely rational fear of physical punishment only hours away.